In one of my trips to Ethiopia in 2008, I was taken to a graveyard and was told about a group of 260 people living and sleeping in the graveyard. It was basically their home. At least 50% of the people there were children, and many of these children spent their days on the streets of Addis Ababa begging or doing what they can to raise money to feed themselves. They lived in wee houses made out of whatever they could find, bits of plastic, bits of wood, and they built these houses over the top of graves. There was all sorts of issues in the graveyard. There was people there who were extremely malnourished. In fact, at one stage I was taken into one of the small houses, and there was a young girl, probably around 18 or 19 years of age, and she was lying on the ground, on the mud, very ill. So it was one of the worst situations that I've seen in many a trip that I made to Africa. The spokesperson that day stood up and said, if somebody doesn't help us soon, we're all going to die. They had no running water, had no electricity, very little food. They had no sanitation whatsoever. So the graveyard wasn't only where they lived, but it was also where they went to the toilet and stuff like that. And when the rain came, everything flowed down through the cemetery. So Children of Crossfire decided to get involved. We put a feeding program in place so that the people in the graveyard had access to food. We also bought them thicker blankets so that they could be warm at night. Eventually we employed a medical person to go into the graveyard on a regular basis just to check up on the general health and treat any issues that they could treat there. We also employed a teacher to go in, and they set up a school underneath the tree. Eventually we raised enough money and we bought 60 small condos, you might say. It was like a small block with 60 rooms in it. Each room was a house for the 60 families, all 260 people. And around 2010, they all left the graveyard and moved into these houses. So in there, I'm delighted to say that they were dry, they were warm, they had electricity, they had toilets, and we were still involved in the feeding program at that point. In fact, the feeding program went on for about 10 years. Because even though we moved that community into the better accommodation, they were still poor. There were people who lived and begged on the street, some of them for 18 years or more. We also built a school beside the small condos, where eventually the children there were able to go to school. We involved a training program with the parents so they could learn income generating skills like candle making, brush and broom making, mushroom growing, so at least they could begin to earn money for themselves. One person I met in the graveyard was a young girl called Tanaya. And Tanaya was only 11 or 12 years of age when I first met her in the graveyard. And her story always sticks with me. Tanaya's parents were both dead. Her daddy died from, I think, malaria, and her mommy was down washing clothes one day by the river beside the graveyard, and she got washed away. So Tanaya was left in charge of her 4 siblings, or 4 younger siblings. Obviously there's no safety net or anything for children like Tanaya. So she became officially known as a child head of household. And she was responsible for her 4 siblings living in that graveyard. And I couldn't get Tanaya out of my head because I had a daughter the same age in Derry. And I just couldn't help thinking how different their lifestyles were. In 2011, I went back out to Ethiopia and I went to visit the families in their new accommodation, and it was my first time visiting them after they'd moved in. And the children were all out at the front of the condos in the wee forecourt, and they were dancing and they were singing and they were in the school uniforms. And it was just an incredible experience to see them so happy. And then to go in and visit their school and see them all just being children. I remember thinking that day when I left how different it was from a couple of years ago when I left them in the graveyard, literally sitting in the mud. So we continued the feeding programme. The parents obviously learnt a few skills that we had worked on with them, and then some of them got jobs in their own right because now they were employable, because they weren't beggars on the street. They were people who had their own homes and were living in their own homes. They were seen differently, and therefore they were able to tie down jobs and things. And one of my other visits, I went out and I met Tanaya, and Tanaya invited us all up to her wee condo. There was about 3 or 4 of us from Ireland there. And I sat down in a chair in her living room, and then she placed a young baby in my arms. And it was young Barcott. She had just given birth to her son. And again, I was really moved by that because I couldn't help thinking that this is a life that might never have been. Because living in the graveyard, I don't think they would have survived. When we originally purchased the condos, we purchased them in the name of the family and also the local organisation, which was the Addis Catholic Secretariat in Ethiopia. And the reason why we done that is because when the families moved into the condos, they were still very, very poor. And there was always a concern that maybe they would be forced to sell their new home just to get money to survive. And obviously we didn't want that to happen. But with every project, you have to look at how we make it sustainable. And what was important from the Children Crossfire viewpoint, that we had the time to leave these families in a position that they could support themselves, and that eventually they would own their own home outright. In recent months, I've been out in Ethiopia, and the families, after 10 years, were given the deeds of their homes. And that was a fantastic occasion for them. But it was also a great occasion for Children Crossfire and the project that we supported. And when I went out recently, I went to visit the families again. And they were all there, all the families, standing with the deeds of their houses. For me, it was an emotional thing, really. But for them, it was a very proud moment. As you can imagine, they're always very, very welcoming. And on special occasions there, they have what they call coffee ceremonies. And they had a coffee ceremony that day when we arrived. The person stood up in the cemetery in 2008 and said, if somebody doesn't do something soon, we're all going to die. Stood up and made a speech that day as well. There was 2 things that stood out for me that day in his speech. One of them was that he said, we have defeated poverty. It was just an incredible thing to hear him say that. The second thing he says was that they no longer need any support from Children in Crossfire. I also met Tanaya. I was asking her how things were. And she said that she's now a supervisor in a soap making business. And everything is going well for her. And then of course I met young Barcott, who was now 5 or 6 years of age. And he's attending school. She was happy, Barcott was happy, and they were healthy. We couldn't have done any of that work without the support of people here. The ongoing support of Children in Crossfire allowed us to put a feeding programme in place for 10 years. It allowed us to invest in training skills for the community. With the support we received, we were able to buy the condos and give them to the families. And it's just a wonderful experience for me, on behalf of all our donors, to be able to see the difference, the major difference, the life-saving difference that their support has made to that community.